Marvel Television is in a weird place, dude. With Phase 3 of the movies consistently killing it with critics and audiences, the theatrical side of the MCU is arguably at the best place it's ever been. And while people are quick to, with good reason, hold the movies and television shows as completely separate entities, it sort of bums me out that the thriving of the movies coincides with the shows crashing pretty hard. The year got off to the most lukewarm possible start with Iron Fist. Defenders was by comparison a masterpiece, but on its own merits just kinda passable. And then, ooh boy, then there was Inhumans, a show that I only watched 2 episodes of and yet can confidently say is tied with Class for the least enjoyment I've gotten watching a TV show ever. And no, I'm not counting Legion or Gifted in this little exercise, although I've heard good things about both of those. Point being, Punisher's competition as far as the MCU shows went was non-existent. And yet I don't think it's just a lowered bar that makes me say it's a gem of a show, bordering on masterwork and the first Marvel show to reach the heights of Daredevil Season 1. That said, people seem kinda torn on it, and I think I know why, so allow me to indulge in some slight disclaimers before the gushing starts. Yeah, this one's a big shock, right? Since the beginning, the most common complaint with all these shows has been the overly deliberate pacing, which makes it seem like each season is suffering from multiple torn ligaments due to all the stretching needed to reach the 13-episode count. Hell, even the one season that was only 8 hours long still felt the need to structure its story so that at least 2 of those hours could have been cut. It's a bigger problem for these shows because with no episodes functioning as standalone plots, you really do have to watch everything to get the full story. And if the plot tying all 13 hours together doesn't actually need the length of half a dozen feature films to play out, then a lot of time is going to be spent spinning wheels. This approach to pacing in a superhero property is part of what made Daredevil unique at the time of release, but over the years people have gotten tired of it, and if you're someone who understandably came to a TV show about the Punisher for something other than people sitting around in rooms talking, then 70% of this bad boy just wasn't made for you. I for one liked most of the sitting around talking, and I actually think this is the best of the Netflix shows at using its time wisely and justifying the episode count, beyond the first one. Speaking of which, there's nothing that'll make people sour on you more than a bad first impression, and this might be the single most boring first episode of a TV show this good that I've ever seen. It tells us nothing about Frank Castle that we didn't already know, spends most of its time setting up characters and events that are never relevant to any other episode of the series, has a plot built on predictable cliches, and doesn't even feature the status quo shift that puts Frank on his journey for this series. That instead happens with the start of episode 2. I found myself zoning out for large portions of it on both of my watch-throughs. The only purpose it really serves is as a good mood setter, I guess. And honestly, I recommend treating episode 2 like the real start of the show because it is brilliant. Sadly, a problem that lasts more than one episode is Dinah, our major female support character and partial eyes into the main character's shenanigans, which is by now a standard of these shows. She can best be summed up as Misty Night Light, except not as narratively engaging as a foggy lamp for children probably would be. She becomes slightly less superfluous when she and Frank actually cross paths in episode 4 or 5, but for the most part she's just plain boring. The moments where the show comes closest to feeling like it's wasting my time are all centered around her, and I think she's bound to have a similar effect on other people. I know she's my personal biggest complaint with the whole series, and I hope the show scraps her going forward. It was inevitable that a show about this character in 2017 was going to broach some uncomfortable topics. And while the show handles the issues of guns, killing, governmental control, society's relationship with the military, and the media's effect on all of these things as maturely as possible, I imagine the people with very strong leanings on either side of those issues, or the people who just wanted the Punisher to be wanton escapist violence, will find themselves at odds with it at various points. Are we good? Is that all the potential negatives out of the way? Sweet. Punisher picks up almost immediately into episode 2, which is an engaging cat-and-mouse chase that builds Frank's character not just in terms of his tragic backstory, but also the surprisingly clever brain behind the blunt instrument, and plays, like the best parts of these shows, as a masterclass in assuming audience intelligence. This approach to Castle is really what makes the show, and honestly what made his bits of Daredevil the height of Marvel Netflix prior to this point. Frank isn't just a loaded gun, like he can sometimes be in the comics. In spite of the fact that he has absolutely zero qualms killing the people that wrong him, He's a fully sympathetic and rounded character as opposed to a force of nature, and he continuously proves to be the most level-headed and smartest person in the room, despite all appearances to the contrary. I understand how easy it must be to picture a character like the Punisher as nothing more than a gun-toting crazy, especially given his inception as an antagonist for the likes of Spider-Man and Daredevil. But I see this as the take to point to if one wants to justify ever calling Punisher a hero. On that note, though, I think Punisher is probably the single most accessible thing in the Marvel Cinematic Universe for someone who doesn't like superhero stories at all. As grounded as the other Marvel Netflix shows can be, to the point that they can occasionally feel like they're ashamed to be about anything remotely supernatural, the inescapable fact is that you're still watching people with superpowers fight magic ninjas, mob bosses with strength-enhancing suits, and people with mind control powers. Punisher don't have that. I'd almost go so far as to say the Punisher doesn't have a traditional villain figure at all. There's not even the customary vague reference to the incident to let you know that this takes place in the same world as the Avengers. This is absolutely the perfect show for someone who doesn't care to be initiated with the MCU or superheroes in general beforehand. I'd go so far as to say that it avoids being any kind of genre fiction. Even taking the supernatural elements out of the likes of Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., Jessica Jones, and Luke Cage, those are still a spy show, a noir detective show, and a blaxploitation show, respectively. Punisher isn't action-heavy enough to be primarily an action show, though the action scenes we do get are effective and visceral, and I'm not sure the governmental themes overtake the show enough to call it a political thriller either. What The Punisher really is just the story of a man, home from war, who, after having his home taken away from him, decides to make war his reason for existing. The conflict of whether Frank can ever have a home again drives the whole series, and the question of where home even is for someone like him is at the heart of the show's most poignant scene. This theme isn't only explored through Frank, though. Most of the core cast is made up of vets, and the show holds no punches when displaying the awful personal and external results that come when a society looks at its soldiers as tools of war first and men second. Even when all their fighting was supposed to be done, a fighter is all that the world will let Frank Castle, Billy Russo, or Lewis Wilson be. And it's the failure of higher authorities to view these men as human that leads to them all turning on each other and creating situations where innocent people get caught in the crossfire. The biggest exemplars of this on the show are Castle's new partner in crime, Micro, along with his family. Behind Frank himself, Micro and Frank's relationship is probably the show's greatest boon. Eben Moss-Bachrach and John Bernthal have the chemistry of two people who have been playing opposite each other for years, and the growth of the dynamic between the two characters is so natural that never once do I question them, going from antagonistic strangers to the best of friends. It's through Micro that Frank really has a chance to be something greater than the role circumstances and society have assigned him. Micro's family is still alive after all, and despite not being able to see them due to a conspiracy, Micro has the chance to truly return home with Frank's help, and getting him there allows Frank to come to terms with his own situation. The pair are great foils for each other. Partnering the Punisher up with someone who's very clearly squeamish about blood and violence is genius, and having the two of them argue over priorities means both are forced to compromise in certain situations. It also makes for some consistently hilarious Odd Couple-style banter. In fact, the show's second best moment is the two of them having a laugh riot while getting more drunk than a kitchen Irishman. Then there's Micro's family, who, under the impression that he's long dead, play a fractured family with an unresolved grief in a way that's so grounded you can't help but feel for them. When Frank ends up tangled in with them, all parties have a genuine chemistry. Things that happen between them and Frank are a little telegraphed, but I love the way it's executed. Frank's war buddy Curtis also reads like a light at the end of the tunnel, being someone who actually managed to make a second life that the other characters in his situation wish they could have. I mentioned the characters Lewis Wilson and Billy Russo, and while both serve to highlight how ultimately decent Frank is by acting as extremes of his dark potential, it's Wilson who's a genuinely terrifying depiction of what a disillusioned, wayward trauma victim could be. Daniel Weber plays it so close to reality in intonation and twisted sense of morality that it's actually frightening. This isn't a villain, nor is he just a cipher for an idea. This is a guy you could meet on the street, and what he does is the type of thing that happens or comes close to happening every day in this country. He's another highlight of the whole experience easily. I touched briefly on the action earlier, but let me end off by saying that this isn't a show that's going to give you the type of action spectacle to rave about for weeks, but here, that's a strength.
With a very rare exception, the violence here isn't meant to be impressive or appealing. Much like Logan, it's meant to be quick, dirty, and painful to watch before it's any kind of enjoyable. If you find yourself wishing you could revel more in Frank's exploits, then your wants and the show's intent are just at odds. The Punisher is my favorite thing to come out of Marvel television in a long while, and hopefully the first step in redeeming what's been a real lackluster year on that front. Beyond being above a certain age and not too squeamish, I recommend it to absolutely everyone, no qualifiers.